December 21st, 1944. A frozen field southeast of Malmedy, Belgium. The men moving through the tree line were not recruits. Some had fought at Kursk, others had survived the retreat from France. They were Waffen-SS, hand-picked for the offensive that Adolf Hitler himself had codenamed Wacht am Rhein. They had been told this attack would split the Allied armies in two. They had been told the Americans were soft. And for 5 days, as German armor punched through the Ardennes, that story had held. Then the sky above them cracked open. There was no whistle, no rising shriek of an incoming round, no half-second to drop. The first explosion came from nowhere, a sharp, flat crack about 30 feet above the ground, followed by a downward spray of steel fragments that hit men who were already diving for cover. A second burst, a third, each one identical, the same height, the same invisible source, the same rain of shrapnel falling straight into foxholes, into ditches, into every piece of cover that had kept these soldiers alive for years. A sergeant who had survived 4 years on the Eastern Front pressed himself into the frozen mud and waited for the barrage to pass. It did not pass. It hung above him, burst after burst, each one ripping downward. He looked at the ground around him and saw something that made no sense. There were no craters. Every artillery shell he had ever known left a hole in the earth. That was how you read a barrage, by the pattern of craters, by the depth of the impacts, by the dirt thrown skyward. You could judge the caliber, the direction, the correction. You could calculate where the next round would fall and move away from it. This was not theory. This was 5 years of survival distilled into instinct. And now, the instinct was useless. The shells were not hitting the ground. They were detonating in the air, 30 feet up, and showering fragments straight down into every position that should have been safe. Some of the men broke. They ran, not away from the fire, but toward it, screaming, "Kamerad!" with their hands up. They were surrendering to explosions. Others refused to move at all. They stayed in their holes, shaking, because every direction was equally lethal, and the only thing worse than staying was standing. Within hours, American intelligence officers would note something they had never seen before in the war: seasoned German infantry refusing direct orders to advance during an artillery barrage. Not green replacements, veterans, men who had walked through Soviet Katyusha fire without breaking stride, and now they would not leave their bunkers. If you want to know what the Americans put inside those shells and why their own government tried to stop them, hit subscribe and the thumbs up. It helps these stories find the people who care. Here is the question this video will answer. What was inside those American shells that broke soldiers who had survived everything the Eastern Front could throw at them? And why had the United States Army been forbidden by its own government from using it? To understand why those men panicked, you need to understand what they knew. And what they knew was artillery. By December 1944, a German infantryman on the Western Front had been shaped by the most intensive artillery education in human history. Soviet guns had taught him the mathematics of survival. He knew that a standard high-explosive shell buries itself before it detonates. The explosion goes outward and upward, throwing dirt and steel in a cone. If you are below the surface, in a foxhole, a trench, a dugout, the fragments pass over you. The deeper you dig, the safer you are. This was not a guess. This was physics, and it worked. A veteran could hear the caliber of a gun by the sound of the shell in flight. He could estimate the range by the interval between the muzzle flash and the impact. He could read the pattern of a barrage and know whether the guns were walking toward him or away. He could survive a concentration that killed every man standing upright simply by pressing himself 6 inches deeper into the earth. This knowledge was the most valuable thing a soldier carried. More valuable than ammunition. More valuable than food. It was the reason veterans lived and replacements died. It was the invisible line between a man who had seen combat and a man who had not. And on that frozen morning near Malmedy, it became worthless. Because the American shells were not burying themselves in the ground. They were stopping in mid-air. And everything a soldier knew about surviving artillery, every lesson written in blood across 5 years of war, was now a liability. The deeper you dug, the more open you were from above. The foxhole was no longer a shelter, It was a trap. Something had changed, not in the war, in the shell itself. And the story of how that change happened begins not in a weapons factory or a military laboratory, but in a quiet office in Washington, D.C., where a physicist from South Dakota was about to be asked a question that the greatest military engineers in Germany had already tried to answer, and failed. The idea of making a shell explode in midair was not new. Every army in the world had been trying to do it since 1915. The logic was obvious. A shell that hits the ground wastes most of its energy downward. It digs a crater, throws dirt, sends fragments outward in a cone. Anyone lying flat or crouching in a hole survives. But a shell that detonates 10 meters above the surface sends its fragments down, into foxholes, into trenches, into the backs and shoulders and skulls of men who are doing exactly what they were trained to do. The mathematics were brutal. A single air-bursting shell could do the work of 4 or 5 ground impact rounds. Every artilleryman in every army knew this. The problem was making it happen. The standard method was a time fuse, a small mechanical clock built into the nose of the shell. Before firing, the gun crew turned a ring to set the delay. If the shell took 14 seconds to reach the target, you set the fuse for 13.8, and the shell would burst just before impact, a few meters up. In theory, this worked. In practice, it almost never did. The timing had to be perfect within a fraction of a second. Set it a quarter second too long, and the shell hits the ground. Just another crater. Set it a quarter second too short, and it bursts too high. Fragments scatter harmlessly over a wide area. And the variables that affected flight time were enormous. Wind speed, air temperature, humidity, barrel wear, powder temperature, the weight variation between individual shells. A gun crew could do everything right and still get it wrong because the air was 3 degrees colder than the firing table assumed. Even when conditions were perfect, time fuses required something no army could always guarantee: observation. A forward observer had to watch each burst, judge the height, radio a correction, and wait for the next round. In clear weather, on flat ground, with a trained observer in position, this was slow but possible. You might get an effective airburst after 4 or 5 adjustments. But in fog, in rain, at night, or in the dense forests of the Ardennes in December, you were blind. No observer could see the bursts, no corrections could be made. And without corrections, time fuses were a guess. This is the detail that matters. Remember it. The German generals who planned the Ardennes offensive chose their timing deliberately. Mid-December meant short days, long nights, fog, low cloud cover, snow. This weather grounded Allied aircraft. That was the obvious advantage. But it did something else that the German infantry understood in their bones. It made American airburst artillery functionally useless. Without forward observers who could see, the Americans would be forced to use impact fuses, shells that hit the ground and detonated on contact. And German soldiers knew exactly how to survive those. They had been doing it for 5 years. When the offensive launched on December 16th, the weather was everything Berlin had hoped for. Visibility near zero. Clouds sitting on the treetops. The kind of sky that turned the most powerful artillery in the world into a blunt instrument. German infantry advanced through the forest with a confidence built on a simple calculation. The Americans cannot see us, therefore they cannot burst shells above us, therefore our foxholes will hold. Every piece of that logic was correct, except for one thing they did not know. The Americans no longer needed to see. Somewhere inside the nose of every shell fired by Colonel Axelson's guns that morning was a device so secret that fewer people in the Allied military knew about it than knew about the atomic bomb. A device that had taken 4 years to build, had cost more than $1 billion, and had been explicitly forbidden for use on any land battlefield, until the morning it was needed most. It was not a better clock. It was not a more precise timer. It was something that no military engineer in Germany, Britain, or Japan believed could exist. A radar set small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. The shell did not need an observer. It did not need a timer. It did not need clear weather or a correction. It carried its own brain. As it fell toward the Earth, it sent out a radio pulse, listened for the reflection, and when the ground was exactly the right distance away, 30 feet, roughly the height of a two-story house, it detonated itself. Every single time. In fog, in darkness, in snow, over flat ground or broken terrain, without a human being making a single adjustment. The Germans had spent more than a decade trying to build exactly this device. They had launched more than 30 separate research programs. They had assembled teams of their best physicists, their best engineers, their best radio specialists, and every single program had reached the same conclusion. It was impossible. You could not build a radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit in a shell, and even if you could, no vacuum tube, the heart of any radio circuit in 1940, could survive being fired from a cannon. The Americans built it anyway. And the story of how begins with a phone call to a physicist who had never designed a weapon in his life. August 1940, Washington, D.C. A 39-year-old physicist named Merle Tuve picked up a telephone and heard a question that would consume the next 4 years of his life. Tuve was not a weapons designer. He was a geophysicist at the Carnegie Institution, a man who spent his days studying the upper atmosphere by bouncing radio pulses off the ionosphere and measuring how long they took to return. He had grown up in Canton, South Dakota. His childhood friend was Ernest Lawrence, who would win the Nobel Prize for inventing the cyclotron. Tuve had helped pioneer the use of pulsed radio waves, the same principle that led to radar. The question came from Vannevar Bush, the head of the newly created National Defense Research Committee. Bush needed someone to lead a project so difficult that most engineers considered it theoretical. The project had a deliberately vague name, Section T. The task was this: build a fuse that could sense how close it was to a target and detonate at exactly the right moment. No timer, no human adjustment. The shell itself would decide when to explode. Tuve said yes. And then he sat down and calculated what yes actually meant. The fuse would need a miniature radio transmitter to send a signal. It would need a receiver to catch the reflection. It would need a circuit to measure the Doppler shift, the change in frequency caused by the closing distance between the shell and the ground. It would need a battery to power all of this. And every one of these components would need to fit inside the nose cone of a 5-inch artillery shell, a space roughly the size of a pint glass. That was the easy part. The hard part was what happened in the first tenth of a second after firing. When a 5-inch shell leaves the barrel of a naval gun, it accelerates from 0 to 2,800 feet per second in roughly 7 feet. The components inside that shell experience a force of 20,000 Gs, 20,000 times the pull of gravity, instantaneously. At the same moment, the rifling grooves in the barrel set the shell spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute. Every vacuum tube in existence in 1940 was made of glass. Glass does not survive 20,000 Gs. It turns to powder. And without vacuum tubes, there was no way to build a radio transmitter small enough to fit inside a shell. This was the wall that had stopped Germany. This was the wall that had stopped Britain. This was the wall that every physicist who looked at the problem agreed could not be climbed. Tuve's team at the Carnegie Institution, and soon at a new facility they called the Applied Physics Laboratory, housed in a former garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, did not accept that verdict. They went to Sylvania Electric and asked a question no one had asked before. Could you build a vacuum tube that was small enough to fit in a shell nose, rugged enough to survive a cannon shot, and reliable enough to work every time? Sylvania's engineers began testing. They poured steel-reinforced glass. They redesigned the filament mounts. They encased the internal elements in shock-absorbing compounds. Tube after tube shattered in the test rig, a device that simulated the G-forces of a cannon firing. Hundreds of prototypes failed. Each failure was measured, analyzed, rebuilt. And then one held. It was small, barely larger than a man's thumb. It looked nothing like the vacuum tubes in a household radio. But when the test rig slammed it with 20,000 Gs, the filament stayed intact. The glass held. The tube worked. That single component, A thumb-sized vacuum tube that could survive being shot from a cannon was what separated the United States from every other nation on Earth. Germany had better optics, Japan had better torpedoes, Britain had better radar, but no one else had a vacuum tube that could take a punch like that. And without it, the proximity fuse was a theory. With it, the proximity fuse was a weapon. By the summer of 1942, Fuze's team had assembled a working prototype. Each fuse contained roughly 130 miniature components: transmitter, receiver, amplifier, battery, detonator, all packed into a cone of metal 7 inches long. The battery was inert until the moment of firing. The G-force of the shot broke a glass capsule inside the fuse, releasing electrolyte that activated the battery in flight. By the time the shell reached the top of its arc, the radio was already transmitting. In August, the Navy brought the prototype to the Chesapeake Bay for a live fire test aboard the cruiser USS Cleveland. The targets were 3 radio-controlled drones, small unmanned aircraft performing evasive maneuvers. The gun crews loaded the shells, aimed, and fired. They brought down all 3 drones on the first day. 4 bursts, 3 kills. The Navy canceled the rest of the test. There was nothing left to prove. Within weeks, production contracts went out to 5 companies: Crosley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, McQuay Norris. The order was for millions of fuses. The secrecy classification was set higher than radar. The cover name was deliberately misleading: VT fuse, variable time. It sounded like a better clock. It was anything but. Now the fuse needed to reach the fleet, and the man chosen to carry the first 5,000 shells across the Pacific to Admiral Halsey was a Navy commander named William Parsons, a quiet ordnance specialist who had helped test the fuse at Dahlgren Proving Ground. Remember that name, because 2.5 years later, William Parsons would climb into the bomb bay of a B-29 called Enola Gay and arm a very different weapon over a very different target. But in late 1942, his cargo was 5,000 artillery shells, and they were about to change the war at sea. January 5, 1943, waters south of Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Red Cochran was commanding the aft 5-inch battery aboard the light cruiser USS Helena when 4 Japanese dive bombers dropped out of the clouds. They were Aichi D-3As, slow, sturdy, accurate. The kind of aircraft that had helped sink battleships at Pearl Harbor 13 months earlier. One of them scored a direct hit on the New Zealand cruiser Achilles before the group broke off and turned away. The attack was already over. The bombers were departing. What Cochran did next was almost an afterthought. A few parting shots at retreating aircraft that were already at the edge of effective range. His gun crews loaded the new shells, the ones with the VT fuses they had been told about but had never fired in combat. They aimed at the nearest Val and fired 2 salvos. Neither salvo hit the aircraft. That was the point. The shells did not need to hit. One of them passed close enough to the dive bomber to sense its presence. The reflected radio signal tripped the fuse, and the shell detonated in midair, spraying the aircraft with shrapnel from a distance. The Val shuddered, rolled, and went into the sea. It was the first time in the history of warfare that a shell had deliberately destroyed an aircraft without making direct contact. 3 shells, 1 kill. At a range where conventional fuses would have required hundreds of rounds and extraordinary luck. Within weeks, the Navy began distributing VT-fused ammunition across the Pacific Fleet. The results were immediate. For the remainder of 1943, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire was credited with more than half of all Japanese aircraft shot down by naval guns. The mathematics that Fuze's team had calculated in a garage in Silver Spring were proving true in combat. A VT-fused shell was roughly 5 times more lethal than a conventional round. Where it had once taken an average of 4,000 shells to bring down a single aircraft, the number began falling toward hundreds, and kept falling. Japanese pilots noticed before Japanese intelligence did. Attack runs that had once cost a squadron 2 or 3 aircraft now cost 6, then 8. Bombing accuracy collapsed because pilots had to release early to escape the kill zone. By mid-1944, The VT Fuze had helped make conventional air attacks on American task forces so costly that Japan turned in desperation to the only tactic that could still reach the ships, the kamikaze. But here is what matters for the story on the ground in Europe. While the Navy was using proximity fuses to sweep the Pacific sky, the United States Army was forbidden to fire a single one. The reason was fear. Every shell that missed its target in the Pacific fell into the ocean and sank. No enemy would ever recover it. No intelligence officer would ever disassemble it and understand the circuit inside. But on land, a shell that failed to detonate, and roughly 1 in 10 did fail, would bury itself in the mud, intact, waiting to be found. And if the Germans found one, they might do two things that terrified the Pentagon more than any battlefield loss. They might reverse engineer the fuse and use it against Allied bombers. Or they might find a way to jam the radio signal and render every VT shell in the inventory useless. So the order held. All through 1943 and into 1944, American ground troops fought and died with conventional artillery, while the most effective infantry weapon of the war sat in crates in warehouses across England, labeled with a cover name that meant nothing. The first crack in the embargo came not from the army, but from the sky over London. June 1944, 1 week after D-Day, Germany launched a new weapon across the English Channel, the V-1 flying bomb. It was small, fast, and pilotless. It flew at nearly 400 miles per hour at an altitude of roughly 2,000 feet, and when its engine cut out, it dove into whatever was beneath it. Within days, V-1s were hitting London at a rate of more than 100 per day. Thousands of civilians were dying. The city that had survived the Blitz was being terrorized again, and conventional anti-aircraft guns could not stop the onslaught. The buzz bombs were too fast and too small for timed fuses. Section T modified proximity fuses for British 3.7-inch and American 90mm anti-aircraft shells. In mid-July, 500 guns were rushed to the English Channel coast. The effect was the difference between blindfolded boxing and fighting with open eyes. In the first week, VT-fused shells destroyed 24% of incoming V-1s. By the fourth week, 79%. On the last day of the campaign, 104 buzz bombs were detected approaching England. 68 were destroyed by VT shells. Only 4 reached London. The fuse had saved the city, but it had also blown the secret wide open. Fragments of VT shells were now scattered across the English countryside, where anyone might find them. The theoretical danger of enemy recovery was now real. And still, the army could not use them against ground troops. Not in the hedgerows of Normandy, where a single air-bursting shell could have cleared a machine gun nest in seconds. Not at the Siegfried Line, where German infantry sat in concrete bunkers that ground-impact shells barely scratched. Not in the forests of the Hurtgen, where treetop bursts would have been devastating. Eisenhower pushed. The Pentagon resisted. The argument went back and forth through the fall of 1944, while American infantrymen fought with one hand tied behind their back. Then, on December 16th, Hitler launched 25 German divisions into the Ardennes, and a colonel in Belgium decided that the rule no longer applied. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning, the Ardennes Forest. 25 German divisions came out of the fog, 200,000 men, 600 tanks, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, all of it hidden for weeks under radio silence so complete that Allied intelligence had missed the largest German troop concentration since 1941. The attack hit the thinnest sector of the American line, 80 miles of front held by 4 divisions, 2 of them fresh and untested, 2 battered and resting. The first hours were chaos. German artillery hit command posts, supply dumps, communication lines. Paratroopers dropped behind American positions. Panzer columns pushed through gaps that did not exist on any Allied map the day before. Along the length of the front, American units were cut off, surrounded, overrun. The word breakthrough appeared in situation reports before noon, and the weather was exactly what Berlin had ordered. Fog so thick a man could not see 50 yards. Clouds pressed against the treetops. No Allied aircraft could fly. No forward observers could see. The American artillery, the most powerful in the world, was reduced to firing blind, impact fuses only, shells burying themselves in frozen ground where they killed trees and dirt and nothing else. At the northern edge of the attack, the German 326th Volksgrenadier Division drove toward the town of Monschau. Standing in their way was one of the smallest combat units on the American line, the 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert O'Brien. Cavalry reconnaissance squadrons were not designed to hold ground. They were built for speed. Light vehicles, small arms, no heavy weapons. O'Brien had roughly 400 men spread across a front so wide he had no reserves. Every trooper was in the line. When the German infantry hit at dawn, O'Brien's cavalrymen fought from their positions, but the numbers were overwhelming. The 326th pushed forward through the ravines south of Monschau, working around the flanks, pressing toward high ground that would crack the entire northern shoulder of the American defense. O'Brien called for artillery. The call went to Colonel George Axelson, commander of the 406th Artillery Group. Axelson had guns, he had ammunition, and he had something else: wooden crates marked with a designation his crews had never seen before, delivered days earlier under a secrecy classification that came with a direct order. Do not fire these shells without explicit authorization from Supreme Headquarters. Axelson did not have authorization. Eisenhower had not yet approved the use of the VT fuse on land. The embargo that had held for 2 years was still technically in force, and the cavalry troopers at Monschau were about to be overrun. He made the call in minutes. He ordered his batteries to load the VT shells. The gun crews followed the same loading procedure they used for every fire mission. Set the charge, confirm the azimuth, report ready. But when the shells left the tubes and arced through the fog toward the German positions, what happened on the receiving end was unlike anything the 326th Volksgrenadier Division had ever experienced. The first rounds did not hit the ground. They detonated 30 feet above the advancing infantry, in the fog, without warning, spraying fragments straight down. The German soldiers heard nothing before the first burst. The shells were high velocity, faster than their own sound. There was no whistle. There was no time to react. One moment the advance was moving. The next, men were falling in clusters, hit from above by steel that came through the fog like invisible rain. The German attack on Monschau stopped, not slowed, stopped. The 326th Volksgrenadier Division pulled back into the ravines and did not attack that sector again. 400 American cavalrymen, supported by artillery that could see through weather, held a position that the German plan had assumed would collapse in hours. The northern shoulder of the Bulge held that day. It would hold for the rest of the battle. 3 days later, on December 19th, Eisenhower formally requested clearance to use the VT fuse across the European theater. He had been demanding this for months. Now, with the largest German offensive since 1941 tearing through his lines, the argument was over. 2 days after that, on December 21st, all restrictions were removed. Every artillery unit in the Allied armies was authorized to fire proximity-fused shells. The crates came out of the warehouses. The shells were distributed by truck through the snow to battery positions across Belgium and Luxembourg. Gun crews received hasty instructions. Load and fire like any other shell. No adjustment needed, no observer required. The fuse does the work. Within 48 hours, hundreds of American guns were firing VT rounds into the teeth of the German offensive, and the reports that began coming back from the front, from intelligence officers debriefing prisoners, from forward units counting bodies, from commanders watching through binoculars, described something that none of them had language for. German soldiers who had survived Stalingrad, who had survived Kursk, who had marched through 5 years of the most devastating artillery in human history, were coming apart. Not because the shells were bigger, not because there were more of them, but because the shells were doing something that no artillery shell had ever done before, and every survival instinct these men possessed was making it worse. What happened in the forests and fields around Malmedy in the last week of December 1944 is one of the most quietly devastating chapters in the history of ground warfare, and it began with the men who thought they were safest, the ones deepest in their holes. The men of Kampfgruppe Skorzeny attacked toward Malmedy in the early morning darkness of the last week of December. They were SS, Otto Skorzeny's hand-picked troops, veterans of operations so dangerous that the unit had been assembled specifically for this offensive. They had crossed frozen ground under cover of fog, moved through artillery-shattered villages without hesitation, and reached the outskirts of a town defended by American infantry dug in along a railway embankment. They had done this before. They knew what came next. The Americans would call for artillery. Shells would fall. The ground would shake. And the soldiers who kept moving, low, fast, between the impacts, would reach the embankment alive. This was not bravery. It was arithmetic. You calculated the pattern, you moved in the gaps, and you lived. The American guns opened up. But there was no pattern. The first shell detonated above the tree line, roughly 30 feet up. A flat crack, then a downward hiss of fragments. Then another, and another. Not in a line, not in a bracket, not in any sequence that made tactical sense. The bursts hung in the air at a uniform height, as if the sky itself had become a ceiling of shrapnel. Men dove for cover, and the fragments followed them down. Into shell craters, into ditches, into the shallow depressions that a soldier's body carves into snow when he tries to press himself flat. A man in the open could at least run. A man in a foxhole could only look up. Among the attacking SS troops, something broke. Not a position, not a line, something inside them. American artillerymen on the ridge above Malmedy watched through binoculars as German soldiers stopped advancing, stopped retreating, and instead ran directly toward the American lines with their hands in the air, screaming, "Kamerad!" the German surrender call. They were not surrendering to soldiers. They were surrendering to the artillery. They had decided that being captured was less dangerous than remaining under shells they could not understand. Others did the opposite. They froze in place. They went flat and stayed flat, refusing to move in any direction because no direction offered safety. The instinct that had kept them alive on every other battlefield, get down, get small, get into a hole, was now the thing killing them. Every fragment came from above. The deeper the hole, the less chance of escape. American intelligence officers began receiving prisoners within hours. The debriefings followed a pattern that would repeat itself across the Ardennes for the next 3 weeks. The prisoners were coherent but shaken in a way that interrogators had not seen before. Not wounded, not shell-shocked in the traditional sense, but disoriented at a level that seemed almost cognitive. The word that appeared most often in the reports was dazed. The prisoners all said the same thing, though they said it differently. They could not understand what had happened. They knew artillery. They knew what shells did. These shells did not behave like shells. There were no craters. There was no pattern to dodge. There was no warning sound. And the fragments came from the wrong direction, from above, not from the side. One prisoner told his interrogator that he believed the Americans had invented a shell that could think. He was not far wrong. What the prisoners could not grasp, what no German soldier in the Ardennes could grasp without understanding the electronics inside the fuse, was that the shells did not need to be aimed at a specific point. They did not need to be timed. They detected the ground automatically and detonated at the optimum height for maximum fragmentation. Every shell, every time, regardless of weather, terrain, or visibility. The fog that was supposed to protect the German infantry had become irrelevant. The darkness that was supposed to cover their movement made no difference. The fuse did not use light. It used radio waves. And radio waves pass through fog the way sunlight passes through glass. German commanders along the Ardennes front responded the only way they could. They ordered their men to stay in reinforced bunkers and not move during American barrages. But the reports from the front told a different story. The shrapnel was penetrating log-reinforced positions. It was cutting communication wires strung along the ground. It was reaching men who were doing everything right by every standard of field fortification they had ever been taught. And in at least one documented case, German infantry refused direct orders to leave their bunkers and advance. Not because they were cowards, because they had done the math, and the math no longer worked. Word spread through German units faster than any official communication. Within days, commanders across the sector were reporting the same phenomenon. Men who would advance under mortar fire, under machine gun fire, under conventional artillery, would not advance under the American shells that left no craters. A reward was offered. German officers told their men that anyone who found an unexploded American fuse and brought it back would receive preferential treatment. They needed to understand what was inside those shells. They needed to find a counter. They never found one. On Christmas night, Patton's Third Army was driving north to relieve Bastogne. Near the town of Echternach, a German battalion attempted to cross the Sauer River under cover of darkness. They were caught in the open, on the bank, on improvised bridges, in the shallow water, by American guns firing VT-fused shells. When the barrage lifted, the Americans counted the dead. The number was 702. 1 battalion, 1 river crossing, 1 barrage. George Patton sat down and wrote a letter to the Chief of Army Ordnance that would become one of the most quoted passages of the war. Patton's letter was dated late December 1944 and addressed to Major General Levin Campbell, the Chief of Army Ordnance. It was short, blunt, and written in the style that made Patton simultaneously the most quoted and most reprimanded general in the Allied armies. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River, with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first. That last sentence, I am glad that you all thought of it first, was not a pleasantry. Patton understood exactly what he was saying. He was a man who had spent his life studying the history of weapons, and he recognized what the proximity fuse meant. It was not an incremental improvement. It was not a bigger bomb or a faster bullet. It was a fundamental shift in what artillery could do to human beings in prepared positions. And the nation that had it first would hold an advantage that the other side could not answer by digging deeper, building thicker, or fighting harder. What Patton did not know, what almost no one outside a small circle in Washington knew, was how close that sentence came to the opposite truth. Because Germany had not merely failed to think of it first, Germany had thought of it at the same time, and tried, and failed. Beginning in the early 1930s, German military engineers had launched research program after research program aimed at building a proximity fuse. The number of separate efforts would eventually exceed 30. Some estimates place it closer to 50. German physics was not the problem. These were the same laboratories that had split the atom, that had built the world's first operational jet fighter, that had put a ballistic missile into the edge of space. The scientists were capable. The theory was understood. The concept was identical to what Merle Tuve's team had pursued in Silver Spring. But the fuse was never a problem of physics. It was a problem of production. To build a working VT fuse, you needed vacuum tubes that could survive being fired from a cannon. To build millions of working VT fuses, you needed an industrial ecosystem that could manufacture those tubes, along with 129 other miniaturized components, at a rate of 70,000 units per day, with a failure rate low enough that 9 out of 10 shells would function correctly. You needed glass workers, radio engineers, chemical specialists for the wet cell batteries, precision machinists for the detonator assemblies, and quality control systems that caught defects invisible to the naked eye. You needed 87 different firms operating 110 factories in coordination, all under a secrecy regime that prevented any single factory from knowing what the final product was. Germany in 1944 could not do this. Not because of Allied bombing, though that made it worse. Not because of resource shortages, though those were real. But because the American industrial system operated on a principle that the German system did not share. Standardized mass production of precision components across dozens of independent manufacturers, coordinated by civilian engineers who had spent 2 decades building radios, refrigerators, and automobiles on assembly lines that German industry had studied and admired but never replicated at the same depth. The same Crosley Corporation that assembled proximity fuses had been building consumer radios in Cincinnati since the 1920s. The same Eastman Kodak that manufactured Fuze components had spent decades perfecting the mass production of precision optics for cameras. The same Sylvania that made the vacuum tubes had been producing miniature glass components for hearing aids. None of these companies had ever built a weapon before 1941. All of them turned out to be exactly what a weapon needed. This is the part of the answer that goes deeper than the shell itself. The German soldier in his foxhole near Malmedy, pressing his face into the dirt while fragments rained down from above, was not simply facing a better piece of technology. He was facing the output of an industrial civilization that could take a physicist's idea, hand it to a radio manufacturer, a camera company, and a hearing aid factory, and produce 22 million functioning units at $18 apiece. Germany spent 15 years trying to build one that worked. America built 22 million in 3. On May 10, 1945, 2 days after the German surrender, American officers sat down with Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring for an interrogation that covered every aspect of the air war. General Karl Spaatz, commander of American strategic air forces in Europe, asked Göring a direct question. "Have you any knowledge of a proximity fuse?" Göring said yes. He said Germany's version would have been ready for production in 3 or 4 months. He had been saying that for years. The truth was in the arithmetic. 30 programs, 15 years, 0 fuses in combat. Against 4 years, 1 program, 22 million fuses, and the letter from George Patton calling it the weapon that required a new method of warfare. And the deepest truth was simpler still. It was visible in the frozen ground around Malmedy, in the banks of the Sauer River, in the silence of the forests after the barrages lifted. It was visible in the absence of something that should have been there and was not. No craters. The ground was untouched. The shells had never reached it. They had done their work in the air, 30 feet above the men who thought the earth would save them. And the earth, for the first time in the history of infantry warfare, had nothing to offer. When the guns stopped near Malmedy, the snow kept falling. American patrols moved forward through the tree line in the gray light of late December and found what the artillery had left behind. Bodies in foxholes, hit from above. Bodies in ditches, curled in the positions they had been trained to take under fire. Knees drawn up, helmets pressed into the dirt, hands over the backs of their necks. They had done everything right. They had followed every lesson that 5 years of war had written into their muscles. And it had not mattered. There were no craters around them. The patrols also found something else. Prisoners. Small groups of German soldiers sitting in the snow with their hands visible, waiting. Not wounded, not surrounded. Simply finished. The interrogators who processed them in the following days noted a quality that was difficult to describe in official reports. A kind of blankness, as if the men had encountered something that fell outside the categories their experience had built. They had survived the Eastern Front. They had survived the hedgerows. They had survived things that killed better men. And then a shell had exploded above them at the precise height that turned their training into a death sentence. And something inside their understanding of war had quietly broken. The Battle of the Bulge ground on through January. The proximity fuse was one of many factors in the German defeat. Allied air power returned when the weather cleared, Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne, and the sheer weight of American logistics crushed an offensive that Germany could not sustain. But in the forests and fields where infantry fought infantry, the VT fuse did something no other weapon in the European theater had done. It made the act of taking cover more dangerous than the act of standing in the open. And for soldiers who had built their entire survival around cover, that inversion was not a tactical problem. It was a psychological one. It was the end of a world they understood. Colonel George Axelson, who broke the embargo on December 16th and fired the first VT fuse ground shells in Europe without authorization, was never reprimanded. 3 days after his decision, Eisenhower made it official. The 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, the 400 troopers Axelson's guns had saved at Monschau, received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest unit award in the United States military. It was the only cavalry squadron so honored in the entire war. Merle Tuve, the physicist from South Dakota who had led Section T from a rented garage in Silver Spring to a laboratory of 800 people, stepped down as director of the Applied Physics Laboratory after the war. He returned to the Carnegie Institution, where he spent the rest of his career studying the structure of galaxies. He rarely spoke publicly about the Fuze. He died in Bethesda, Maryland in 1982, at the age of 80. Commander William Parsons, the man who had carried 5,000 VT shells across the Pacific to Admiral Halsey, who had watched Lieutenant Cochrane down the first aircraft with a proximity fuse off Guadalcanal, went on to join the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos. On August 6, 1945, he climbed into the bomb bay of a B-29 over the Pacific and armed the uranium bomb called Little Boy while the aircraft flew toward Hiroshima. He was awarded the Silver Star. He was promoted to Rear Admiral. He died in 1953 at the age of 52. In the span of 31 months, one man had delivered both the proximity fuse and the atomic bomb into combat, the two weapons that, together with radar, historians would judge the three most decisive technological developments of the Second World War. The German research programs, all 30+ of them, produced volumes of reports, dozens of prototypes, and 0 functioning fuses. Goering's claim of 3 or 4 months joined the long list of promises that German leadership made in the final year of the war and could not keep. The engineers were not to blame. The physics was sound. What they lacked was a country that could build 70,000 thumb-sized vacuum tubes a day, each one strong enough to survive a cannon shot, each one cheap enough to throw away. The proximity fuse was declassified in 1945. When the public finally learned what it was, most people shrugged. It was small. It was technical. It was not a mushroom cloud or a 1,000-bomber raid. It did not photograph well. But the men who had been under it knew what it was, and the men who had fired it knew. And George Patton, who understood killing and dying as well as anyone who ever wore a uniform, knew. The German soldiers near Malmedy panicked because the one thing that had always saved them became the thing that killed them. The foxhole, the oldest, simplest, most universal survival tool in the history of infantry warfare, was turned inside out by a device the size of a man's fist, built from a thumb-sized glass tube, powered by a battery that activated in flight, and guided by a radio signal that passed through fog, darkness, snow, and everything else the sky could offer. They panicked because the ground could no longer protect them, and because nothing else could either. This video took weeks to research and write, and if you're still here after 64 minutes, I want to say thank you, sincerely. You're the reason these stories get told. If this changed something you thought you knew, or showed you a piece of the war you hadn't seen before, hit the like button. It's the single biggest thing you can do to help this story reach other people who care about history. Subscribe if you haven't, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in World War II, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those stories matters. Thank you for your time. I'll see you in the next one.